including this one.
Coming to
Stay
you
healthy.
live from the studios of KMUD Community Radio, this is Heroes and Patriots. Heroes and Patriots is a program about national security, intelligence, and foreign policy. Today is Thursday, October 5th, 2023, and we are so glad that you've joined us for the next hour. I'm Mary Massey with co-host John Sakowitz. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Mary. And before we introduce our guest, I just wanted to acknowledge the life and the achievements of a good friend of our show, Senator Dianne Feinstein. Senator Feinstein often listened to our show, particularly when she was chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee. One of our show's interns, Elliot Hershowitz Hale, was one of her interns in her San Francisco office. Senator Feinstein gave my son Ryan, awarded Ryan a congressional nomination to a federal military academy. She emailed us with ideas for the show, with suggestions for the show. She is sorely, sorely missed.
Right. Today's program will be archived at kmud.org and our program website, heroespatriots.org, and Facebook and YouTube. And as she mentioned, our engineer today is Dorothy Schaefer. She's also the membership director at KMUD. So we thank her for being with us today. I want to remind listeners that they can call in with a question on today's topic. The number to call is 707-923-3911. And for the next hour, joining us will be Mark Gaffney. Mr. Gaffney is an environmentalist and peace activist his entire life. He comes to us from Oregon. He organized the first Earth Day at Colorado State University. John, you're a Colorado resident at one point.
Woodland Park, Colorado.
He's authored many books, including two on the 9/11 investigation and final report, as well as the assassination of John F. Kennedy. John, you wanted to say something more before we get him on the air.
Yeah, Mark is such an interesting guy. I think such a brilliant guy, and such a dangerous guy. The truths that he tells are so dangerous. I told him before the show, I'm surprised he's still alive. Whoever they is, the shadow government, what have you. They killed President Kennedy for lots of bad reasons. For withdrawing the cover of the Bay of Pigs, for wanting to withdraw us from Vietnam, for wanting to challenge the Federal Reserve System. They killed Robert Kennedy for going after the mafia. They killed Martin Luther King for trying to mobilize Black Americans against the war in Vietnam. They killed Brother Thomas Merton for trying to mobilize the Catholic Church against the war in Vietnam.
Right.
They will come after you if you challenge their elitism and their secret societies and grab for power. The guy like this, like our guest, comes along once in a while. We are so happy to have him on the show.
And this is Mark Gaffney's first appearance on this program. Welcome, Mark, and thank you for joining us from Oregon.
Thank you, Mary and John. Very happy to be with you.
And we're glad you live in a remote area after what John just indicated. So you've been investigating many, many interesting historical events in the life of the United States, and in particular, 9/11 for many years afterwards. And you've published two books. The most recent one in 2016, Black 9/11, Money, Motive, and Technology. What has compelled you to risk it all, tell the truth, blow the whistle, to investigate in particular 9/11 and to write these books?
It's a long story, but let me just focus on the recent events.
Okay.
There was an article that I posted in August. It was the culmination of a lot of frustration on my part. The title of it was The Demolition of the World Trade Center. And in that article, I summarized the evidence that we have about the demolition. And then I raised questions at the end of it because I've never been fully convinced, that the thermite is what brought down the World Trade Center. And this is the scenario that we've been told by the architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, by Dr. Stephen Jones and a group of other scholars. But I was never fully convinced that this was the full story. And so I wrote this article with a big question mark at the end. And I was contacted shortly after that by a scholar, and I'm not free to name him, but he has been investigating this. This guy's a genius, mathematician, physicist, chemist. He's not based in the United States, but he was in New York on 9/11 and lived through those events, and felt he was hopeful that the 9/11 truth community here in the States would ask the right questions and, figure this out, but it never happened. And he thinks this is because some of the leadership of the 9/11 truth community is basically a controlled opposition. And ever since Dr. Stephen Jones published a letter in the Journal of 9/11 Studies back in 2007, debunking the idea that nukes had been used to bring down the Twin Towers because of the alleged absence of radiation, that's been the story, and it's been taboo. The subject of nukes has been taboo. So I raised a question mark there at the end of that article, and this gentleman contacted me and provided me with information that I was unaware of. And this led to the latest article at the UNS Review about the Plowshare program and how this may have set the stage for nuclear terrorism. And it's a very interesting story. And I was amazed that nobody had ever brought this stuff to light. And the documents that I found have been there all along. And anyone who had done it, if the architects and engineers had done a comprehensive literature review, all of it would have come to light a long time ago. So we have been on I believe, on a detour, a sidetrack, a cul-de-sac for at least 17 years. And we really need to focus in on the nuclear issue, because I think there's been an interesting discussion at this website, the UNS Review, under my article, since the article appeared 10 days ago. And I believe the nuke side has won the debate now.
Mark, we've done many shows on the miniaturization of nukes. We've had Nobel Peace Prize laureate Dr. Ira Helfand on the show, talking about how the real threat of a nuclear war will probably start with the premise that the tactical deployment of them is acceptable. And the tactical deployment can dial down the detonation of a nuke to a fraction, a part of 1 kiloton. Most people think of nukes as taking out whole cities. Nukes that are on top of ICBMs that blow up all of Washington D.C. or all of Moscow. But the truth of the matter is, Israel in particular has perfected certainly has advanced the technology of miniaturizing nukes. Israel has fit nukes into landmines along the Golan Heights. We know that for certain. If nukes are this small, and we're talking about even smaller nukes than suitcase nukes, isn't it possible that nukes could have brought down the Twin Towers on 9/11? So that's the question. Why don't you run us by the whole Plowshares program and how we got to the point of miniaturized nukes?
Yes, well, since you raised that question about how much fissile material are we talking about, let me answer that first. One of the experts cited in my latest paper, Theodore Taylor, was a U.S. weapons designer, and this was our top fission expert. And he was the one who designed this the tiniest nuke in the U.S. arsenal, the Davy Crockett, and it was 0.01 kilotons. 0.01 kilotons, and this could be fired out of a howitzer type cannon. And apparently this was deployed over in Europe during the Cold War. Excuse me, because the U.S. Worried that the Soviets would launch a massive tank attack against Germany, West Germany, and we did not have the means to stop it, or at least it was questionable, whether we could stop it. And so they introduced this Davy Crockett cannon using these small nukes. They were never utilized, fortunately. But this guy, Theodore Taylor, also designed the largest fission weapon, which was, I think, 500 kilotons. So what we're talking about in the World Trade Center is a weapon. And this is something that Taylor himself mentioned in an interview, in a series of interviews with the writer John McPhee, in a book, The Curve of Binding Energy, which has been out for many years. But he stated in that book and in the interviews that led to that book that the World Trade Center, each tower could have been taken down with about 6 grams of fissile material. Now that is, that's less than an ounce. I mean, we're talking about, and both towers would be, you're talking about the mass equivalent of 1 or 2 sticks of chewing gum.
Right.
Wow.
These are really tiny amounts of fissile material, and this tells us how much energy is packed into the mass, the fissile mass here of these weapons. Are very powerful weapons using very small amounts of fissile material. So people have a misunderstanding. Most people do not understand how little of fissile material you would need to do this job. Just incredible amount of energy released here.
Yeah, and it makes sense that they would have been used because if they're placed in the elevator shaft, as you write in your article, the plasma jet would have blown up the elevator shaft and blown just completely vaporized the top third of the towers, and so prevented them from basically falling over to one side on an angle and causing a huge debris field. Tell our audience where you think the miniature nuke might have been placed, how that plasma jet would have worked, and also why radiation hasn't been detected.
Yes, good questions. There's been a lot of misunderstanding about this. One of the, in order to solve a crime, you have to put yourself in the shoes of the criminal. Try to see the world through their eyes. And I don't think this 9/11 Truth community has been successful doing that. The perpetrators of the World Trade Center demolition were facing some very serious constraints on the kind of weapons and the size of weapons that they could have used to do the job. They had to size the weapon properly because the problem with the World Trade Center is the height of the towers from a demolition standpoint. And you mentioned that there was a danger using conventional explosives that the tower could tip over, and we saw this start to happen. In fact, with the South Tower, the top kind of tipped, and then it just disappeared. It was vaporized. But it was a problem because the whole site there at the World Trade Center was lined with the so-called bathtub, and I don't think too many people understand this. The World Trade Center complex, much of it was below the street level. There were shopping centers, parking areas. There was a whole subway system in there, a concourse. It was a huge shopping opportunity, for New Yorkers. And much of it was below sea level. I mean, it was below the level of the Hudson River, and there was a danger that the Hudson River could flood this area. And before they built the towers, they had to build a bathtub, like a wall all the way around this area, 16 acres. And the demolition threatened that wall. And if they had breached the wall by dropping the twin towers, I mean, most of the potential energy is in the top of the building. And there was a danger that the overpressure of dropping all that mass onto the site would breach the bathtub wall. And in that case, the Hudson River would have flooded the area, including the subway system, and Wall Street would have been shut down indefinitely. Mm-hmm. So this had to be prevented. The way of doing that was to use small nukes in the in the central freight elevator shaft, which was the only elevator that served every floor in the building. And this would ensure that you could pulverize the top third or 40% of the building and disperse all this material, turn the concrete to dust, and eject a lot of the material way out beyond the footprint. So this dampened the fall of the material. It reduced the potential energy and prevented the bathtub from being severely damaged. I think that was one of the major constraints, and it's never been discussed by the 9/11 truth community.
And of course, reports showed there was no nuclear residue. I'm guessing that's because this item that you proposed was so small that there wouldn't be anything left. Is that?
Well, yeah, let's discuss that. In his 2007 letter, Dr. Stephen Jones talked about neutron activation and the fission decay products that would, that every nuclear explosion produces. But what I found out is that during the Plowshare program, and even the Los Alamos scientists that were doing the atmospheric testing, they also figured this out and were using boron, the element boron, to prevent neutron activation because it absorbs high energy neutrons. So what they found was that if you pack neutron-rich material around the device, and every 6 inches of this shielding can reduce the amount of neutrons, high energy neutrons, by 90%. So it's possible to reduce the neutron activation. And this is what the problem with high energy neutrons is: they tend to transform everything they come in contact with into radionuclides, which are dangerous, very radioactive. So if you can shield the device and prevent the release of these high energy neutrons, it's possible to cut that neutron activation down almost to zero.
Right. It's 18 minutes back. Excuse me. Go ahead.
Well, yeah. So this would eliminate one entire part of the radioactive problem of high energy neutrons. The other problem of fission products is reduced simply by miniaturizing the device, and you have a much smaller amount of byproducts would be roughly the same as the amount of fissile material. So if you're only talking about a tiny amount of fissile material, then the total radioactive fission byproducts would be much smaller. So if you figure that about 10% of probably about 10% of this material would have been dispersed beyond the site, that would have been undetectable, basically negligible, even right after the event. There would have been some radiation on the site. But as far as we know, there was never any data published on this. So no government authority ever did an official survey of the pile.
And what have professionals, investigators, etc., how have they reacted to what you're proposing?
I don't think they've even considered it. This has never been discussed by the 9/11 truth community. To my knowledge, the architects and engineers do not have any nuclear expertise among their thousands of architects and engineers. And, like I said, they could have done a literature review and found this out easily, but it was never done. That's the question that should be posed to them. Why didn't they look?
Well, we're going to get to that in a second because in preparing for the show last night, I received a message from our friend Jack Carr, the former Navy SEAL and best-selling author, and he helped prepare for the show today. And we're going to get to the whys and the whos, which is just as interesting as the what happened. So just to recap for our audience, we have these small thermonuclear devices. We wouldn't even call them bombs.
John, not thermonuclear. These are not fusion weapons. These would be small fission weapons only.
Small fission weapons. So we have small atomic devices, not hydrogen, but small atomic devices. At the bottom of the freight elevators, the blast goes through the elevator shaft a plasma jet vaporizes the top third of the Twin Towers, and I'm guessing thermite takes down the other 2/3 of the building, so it's a controlled fall. And because the device is packed in boron, there's very little detectable radioactivity. Do I have it? Have I stated the theory accurately?
Yes, that's a good summary. We could qualify that a little. It's not 100% clear how I believe it was a two-stage demolition, and there was data presented by a mathematician named Ansgar Schneider, who showed that the data of the collapse looks like an S-curve, meaning that it was not a smooth collapse. There were two parts to it, which would be consistent with a two-stage demolition. So there were maybe two energy inputs. The first nuclear, the second may have been conventional, or maybe even thermite or thermate. We don't know for sure about that.
Yeah, it's there's no question about that S curve and multiple explosions. If you listen to some of the background audio tapes on the microphones that the firefighters were wearing, you can hear separate explosions. You can even hear the firefighters themselves noting there are separate explosions. Again, there's no way a jet flying into these buildings will account for separate explosions. I think we have a caller, Mark.
Caller, if you're listening, go ahead with your question.
Yes, John. Before you guys go much further with this poppycock, I got to call you on your stuff here. I don't know why you're going to Crazy Town when the truth is so much more presentable. You know, it was a controlled demolition in Building 7. Everyone knows that there was a demolition team in there that set the caps, and you can watch it in slow motion, and you can see the caps detonate. If you slow the footage down 38 times, you can clearly see the detonations of the caps. And it was a controlled demolition, and that's a much more interesting story than making up a story about a nuke that didn't happen.
All right.
We'll let Mark answer the question.
Mark?
Well, we haven't been talking about Building 7. I don't dispute that was a controlled demolition. It was a classic controlled demolition, but the potential energy of Building 7 was not nearly as great as the Twin Towers. They were much higher. So there was no danger of breaching the bathtub by dropping Building 7 with a controlled demolition. The problem that the perpetrators faced was the potential energy of the Twin Towers because of the height. So it was a very serious problem to try to drop them with conventional explosives and not damage the bathtub. That's my point.
Yeah.
I love that address, by the way. Where does John Sakowitz live? Well, he lives in Crazy Town.
It's 20.
And his next door neighbor is Mark Gaffney.
It's 24 minutes past the hour. You're listening to Heroes and Patriots on KMUD.org, and we are speaking this morning with Mark Gaffney, who has written an interesting article, Did the Plowshares Program Set the Stage for Nuclear Terrorism on September 11th? And this comes out of the Plowshares program that began in the late 50s, where there were attempts to make safe ways to do demolition with using nuclear devices. And we are now here. And in 1970s, we already had a safe program, apparently. Yeah. So this is an offshoot of that, or a further development.
Yeah, this Plowshares program was a real thing. I encourage the readers just to Google up Plowshare nukes. And what Mark says is right. These nukes were so miniaturized that they could be shot out of a howitzer. And you could actually, I've seen these, they're declassified now. You could actually watch this on YouTube. So it's real. So the question is, Mark, do investigators know this and they just covered it up? They just buried it? That's my first question. And the second question is, who did this and why?
Okay. I, the reason why we need a forensic investigation to investigate the how is because the how leads to the who. The how is, in any crime, the forensic investigation of what actually happened is critical to determining who is at fault, who is guilty. So that's number one. And what was the other part of the question, John? The first part?
Who and why?
Yeah, did the investigators of the 9/11 Commission, and there were a couple of investigations. Congress came back and they reviewed all the forensic data a second time. Did investigators suspect of this? Did they look into the possibility of a small atomic device? And did they just bury that? Did they just cover it up, or were they just ignorant and failed to consider it?
Well, the first paper I ever wrote about 9/11 was a critique of the NIST report, NIST report. National Institute of Standards and Technology had a mandate to examine the collapse of the World Trade Center and to explain it. Well, they never explained it. They presented a theory that has been pretty seriously debunked and shown to be fraudulent by architects and engineers, and they get a lot of credit for that. But they worked backwards, with a preconceived conclusion, and then they worked backwards to show that's what happened. But the thing about the NIST is that they never allowed any. It came down to their black box, their computer model, which they never allowed independent scientists from outside to look at. So, that right there is a huge red flag. So I looked very deeply into the NIST report. It's like 10,000 pages, and it was on its surface, it's very impressive. It's a lot of work that they did, but most of it was irrelevant, and they did not deal with the real issues.
Did you you say that the response to your writings about 9/11 in particular are not being considered? Are you being criticized, or what is the public saying? I know I read one of your articles and you had over 400 responses.
Almost 500.
It was kind of a mixed bag of, oh wow, and then others like, you're crazy, etc. Could you talk about that? And also, again, you've had no attention from government or anyone that might be appropriate to listen to you and follow up on it.
Well, I must say that for many years I suspected that nukes were used, but I didn't have couldn't. I mean, it's not an easy subject. Otherwise, we would have figured this out a long time ago. It's difficult. I'm just fortunate that an informant helped me to better understand the collapses, and that allowed me to focus and put that article together. And you have to ask the right questions. But it was critical I believe it was critical. And in that article, I showed that neutron activation is really not an issue. It's not, they knew how to control this. They knew how to prevent it. So that the absence of radionuclides is, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
Right.
So this was a logical fallacy that the 9/11 truth community was pursuing for many years, unfortunately.
And the informant, and I'm not going to ask you to name him because I'm sure that's important to keep his identity secret. But what were his credentials? Why was he coming to you?
Well, he was in New York when it happened. It was a very personal thing for him for that reason. Mm-hmm. He's a mathematician and an economist, and very science oriented. And he was hoping the 9/11 truth community would figure it out, And when they never did, then he undertook his own personal investigation. And when I say investigation, I mean he is very, very thorough. He goes right down to all the way to every detail. And he persuaded me. I was very impressed with his research. Mm-hmm. In a word, to put it briefly, I was very impressed with his research, and he convinced me that the nukes were used, and so I undertook that second article.
Right. And has he approached the
He has been very
Commission?
active in the comment section under my article. Some of his comments are very erudite, and he's a gentleman. He's very polite with the other, even when they some of the debate is very acrimonious. We heard it in this last caller.
Right.
People are very rude and insulting, but he didn't play that game. He was a gentleman during the whole discussion, and I think in recent days the nuke side has won the debate up there. Anybody is free to go up there and look and judge for themselves. That's my opinion.
Right. And in what aspects has this program or the development of the Plowshares program been actually used to demolish and I would think fracking or whatever? How has it been used to our knowledge?
Peaceful uses.
Peaceful uses, yes.
One of the major innovations of the Plowshare program was the idea that you could design a nuke for a specific job, tailor-made nukes, designer explosives. And I don't think the public understands this. This is very, very important. Now, Plowshares came to an end in '75. I was in Colorado back in the later days there during that program, and I remember the underground explosions at Rulasan and Rio Blanco. In fact, I was a writer at the Colorado State University newspaper in those days, and I wrote an op-ed, an essay there opposing Rio Blanco, even though I didn't really fully understand Plowshares at that point. But the program was canceled because they could not deliver the economic the economic benefits. They were unable. This thing was unable to generate real economically feasible projects.
Yeah, and the important thing to understand is that Plowshares and the miniaturization of nukes was a thing. I mean, that's an historical fact. It was a thing, and as our guest points out, you can dial down the detonation of these miniaturized nukes to a fraction of 1 kilogram. I think Hiroshima was 14 kilograms.
There's different opinions about it. It's somewhere between 14 and 18 or 20, somewhere in that range.
Yeah, kilotons. And you can dial down one of these Plowshare nukes to a fraction of 1 to 0.01 kiloton. So you can miniaturize nukes, which, by the way, is the fear in the Ukraine battlefield. That the deployment of tactical nukes is a real threat, and it's a slippery slope.
And you're speaking of Russia, right?
Yeah, right. And once you start with a small nuke, you graduate to a bigger nuke, and then finally, you're involved in a nuclear holocaust. I want to get to the who's. So we talked about the collapse of the Twin Towers themselves. So I want to talk about another article that you wrote, which brought me to your attention a while back, the Zionist coup against Kennedy. Now, when we've talked about Kennedy in our show, we've dug up facts that people just don't believe until I point them to, places like YouTube or places like Google. One of the things that people find hard to believe about Kennedy is that he warned of a secret government. In April of the year that he was killed at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City, he warned the Newspaper Publishers of America, the Society of Newspaper Publishers of America. He warned of a secret government. He was explicit about it. We've talked to Ray McGovern about that. He was explicit about a shadow government that he could not control. The other thing that we've learned about Kennedy over the years is that back in 1963, he gave Israel a sworn warning about developing a nuclear reactor. And people say, oh, no, you're anti-Semitic sacklets. Why are you making up stories? Here's another postcard from Crazy Town. Sakowitz. This can't be. Well, the truth is that declassified documents that I've actually seen in the Kennedy archives show that President John Kennedy warned Israeli Prime Minister Levi Eshkol in 1963 that U.S. support for Israel would be, quote unquote, seriously jeopardized if Israel did not allow the United States periodic inspections of its nuclear program. This telegram was dated July 4th, 1963. It congratulates Eshkol on assuming the prime ministership after David Ben-Gurion's resignation, and it recounts talks between Kennedy and Ben-Gurion about these inspections of the nuclear program. I'm going to quote from the telegram now. As I wrote to Mr. Ben-Gurion, the U.S. government's commitment to and support of Israel will be seriously jeopardized if it is thought that we were unable to obtain reliable information on a subject as vital to peace as Israel's efforts in developing nuclear weapons. This is the truth. This is in the Kennedy archives. Why don't you talk a little bit about your other paper, Mark, equally controversial, the Zionist coup against Kennedy?
Well, okay. I was very quite surprised when I discovered that Ben-Gurion resigned from prime minister, right? And he's prime minister, not president,
Correct.
Prime minister.
Yes.
Yeah, he resigned over that difference with John F. Kennedy over the nuclear issue. John Kennedy was trying to rein him in on the Dimona reactor, and instead of responding to Kennedy, Ben-Gurion resigned. He resigned. So, left this big, that is like saying, that's like saying, no, we're not going to negotiate this. He stepped back, and that's shocking. I was shocked by that because I had always thought that Ben-Gurion resigned because of fallout from the Lavon affair. That's another story. But anyway, yeah, this was a big deal. And I think that the U.S. relationship with Israel was in jeopardy at that point because Kennedy was very firm. He was a friend of Israel, but he was very firm on the nuclear issue, and he wasn't going to put up with proliferation. He saw the danger. And this was especially true after the Cuban Missile Crisis,
Right.
I think that really shook him up, and he had a kind of a rebirthing after that. He changed seriously. He became a genuine advocate for a whole new way of doing things, a peace program. He wanted to prepare the American people to accept a peace agreement with the Soviet Union, for example.
All right. So go into your article, the Zionist coup against Kennedy, John Kennedy. What connection was there to the Kennedy assassination? And is there any connection between Zionists and 9/11?
Yeah, this is I was also shocked to learn that Lyndon Baines Johnson was of Jewish ancestry.
Oh.
And he was a very strong advocate for Israel. I don't know if you know this, but
no, I did not.
Yes, absolutely. And his grandmother was Jewish, and he was very much of an advocate on behalf of Israel, and arranged for for refugees, Jewish refugees, to come to the United States, and through Texas, by the way, and arranged funding for this. And there's no doubt that Lyndon Johnson despised Kennedy, and this guy was a scoundrel. I wonder, I don't know how many. I was shocked to learn these things about LBJ, that he was a murderer. He had murdered at least a half a dozen other people before the Kennedy assassination. And there is no doubt in my.
When you say murdered, what, as president?
People that were threatening to expose his criminal activities in business, in Texas. And
Right.
His fraudulent election to the Senate, that was a rigged election. I don't know if you know that, but his original victory that put him in the Senate was a rigged election. He was a scoundrel, I mean, from day one. And he was determined to become president. That was his overriding ambition in life. And he was about to be removed. Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General, was in the midst of, there were hearings in Washington the very day of the assassination that would have led to Johnson being exposed, his criminal activities in Texas being exposed. He would have been removed from the ticket in '64 election.
Wow.
So he was facing his political, demise, really. But by arranging the murder of Kennedy, and there was no doubt that there was a meeting the night before the assassination at Clint Murchison's house in Dallas, and most of the key players were there who were involved in the assassination.
But
so this was thoroughly planned out. He had control over the Texas media, to get the word out, to get his version of events out. This is a long story. We can't cover this in an interview, but
right.
Yeah, this was shocking to me. There's no doubt that LBJ was probably the primary player in the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and I think the CIA was definitely involved, but they were not the primary instrument here.
So again, I'm thinking like a forensic investigator. So if we accept the premise that that plowshare-sized nukes brought down the Twin Towers, you have to ask yourself, well, who had access to this fissionable material, and who had access to the technology? And I'm going to rule out Russia and the other nuclear powers, Russia, China, France, and England. And I'm going to say really there are only two powers left. Elements within the United States, the secret government that President Kennedy, warned us about in his speech to the Society of American Newspaper Publishers in the April of the year that he was killed at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, and Israel. So those are the only two suspects. So which was it, Mark?
Well, you have to ask the question: who had access to the towers? The very fact that the World Trade Center was demolished rules out the Arabs. These 19 so-called jihadists.
Yeah.
There's no way they could have got in there to post plant explosives. So you can rule that out immediately, even before we get to the nuclear question. But in my earlier book, Black 9/11, I found a lot of evidence pointing in the direction of Hank Greenberg. He had been the head of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Right. He was the CEO of AIG that got the biggest bailout in U.S. history up to that point. And his son, Jeffrey Greenberg, was the CEO of Marsh & McLennan, which was based in the North Tower at the very site of the plane impact.
Wow.
Did you know that? I mean,
no.
Most people don't realize that. This should have led to a series of questions right away that within just, you ask a series of questions would have led directly to exposing the people who had security access. Because when he was CEO of AIG, he acquired Kroll, the private security firm, in 1993. Okay, and in 1993, after that first World Trade Center bombing, Kroll got the contract to upgrade security at the World Trade Center. So this would have given Kroll all the blueprints, everything they needed, and security access. So right there, you have a huge red flag pointing to the prime suspect of Hank Greenberg, and of course, the other one would be Larry Silverstein, who owned the building outright, and he owned the Building 7 outright, and had the 99-year lease on the World Trade Center Twin Towers.
And he overinsured his property.
That's right. He insured. In fact, he insured against a terrorist attack.
He made out like a bandit. He made out like a bandit. People don't want to talk about that. Larry Silverstein just netted billions and billions of dollars in insurance money by overinsuring the Twin Towers immediately before they came down.
Just before.
I mean, people
Absolutely.
know, but again, they think I'm sending postcards from Crazy Town, Mark. Tell them it's not so. It's just
Well,
not so.
this whole anti-Semitism issue is a big scam. They use it as a weapon to silence
Correct.
opponents. We have to understand that and not be afraid of that. Yeah, I don't. They can call me any name they want. It doesn't affect me.
No, it's not going to work with me either, Mark, or Mary. Mary is part Jewish, correct, Mary?
Mm-hmm.
And if you Google my name up, the big you will find that I am a direct descendant of Kazimierz Sakowicz, Kazmierz Sakowicz, Sakowicz. I am a direct descendant of the first journalist to document the mass murder of Jews. He did it in Lithuania in 1942. He then mobilized other Jews in Poland, joined the Polish resistance, and the Nazis hunted them down during Operation Tempest and killed them. So if anyone wants to, tar me with the anti-Semite brush, go right ahead. It just ain't true. It just ain't true, brother. I am only interested in the truth. So let's go back to the suspects and why. So we know that if miniature nukes brought down the Twin Towers, we know that it could only have been a nuclear power that brought them down. So again, let's ask the fundamental question: shadow government elements in the United States or Zionists in Israel? Which is it? Connect the dots.
Well, we still have unanswered questions, John. There's still things to be. Who was the primary perpetrator? Is that what you're asking, basically?
Yeah.
I think both were involved. I mean, obviously the Bush administration was complicit with this, but G.W. Bush, he's not bright enough to do this. And Cheney, I'm sure Cheney was deeply involved in the COG, the continuity of government program that played a role in 9/11, and we had traitors at the Pentagon who were involved in this. Absolutely, there's no question about it. Because the United States is now a country, a place where everything is for sale, including integrity.
Right,
everything's for sale here.
Do you want to talk about the Project for a New American Century? That group of warmongering neoconservatives that really, including Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, that literally cooked up this plan to cement the United States in its role as a war machine throughout the world, starting with the Middle East. And we've seen a war in Iraq that was founded on the totally preposterous presumption that Saddam Hussein had nukes, and a 18-year war in Afghanistan, also based on the totally preposterous that we were hunting Osama bin Laden when, in fact, he was in Pakistan. Talk to our audience a little bit about the Project for a New American Century.
Well, let me talk about one of these guys, Richard Pearl. Richard Pearl. Right. Yeah, he was part of that group. Right. And one of the big clues about who done this, is right in the very first paragraph of George Tenet's memoirs, Center of the Storm. And I don't know if you know this, but the morning after the attack, Richard Pearl, George Tenet showed up at the White House as usual because he was giving Bush daily briefings. That was part of the Bush wanted daily briefings. And so Tenet would show up at the White House every morning. And that morning he got there early on September the 12th, the day after the attack. Guess who was already there? Richard Pearl. Right. What was Richard Pearl doing at the White House the day after the attack? He was not an official of the U.S. government. But he was there. I mean, and Tenet was shocked. He was shocked that Pearl was there, and asked the question on the very first page of his memoirs. What was Pearl doing there? Well, I would offer that Pearl was there to brief G.W. Bush about what he needed to know, because Bush couldn't be given more than he had to be closely minded. He had to be monitored because he has a habit of putting his foot in his mouth. So I'm sure that G.W. Bush didn't know any more than he needed to know.
Right. And it's just I'm heartbroken for America, because if everything that we're postulating is true, that we in Israel, or one of our closest allies, brought down the towers so we could cement our role as a war machine, so that we could fight perpetual wars, in places like Iraq and Afghanistan and now Ukraine. That if our number one export is war, that if all this is true and remains unchallenged, we are not just having young Americans, boys and girls in the armed forces, being killed for no reason whatsoever, no reason except for the fact that war is a business and business is good, as Robert Gates said. But we're also, but also just millions of civilians in these countries are dying as well. Again, I come back to the email that we received from Navy SEAL and best-selling author Jack Carr yesterday, and we were talking about why hasn't anyone been held accountable? Why wasn't anyone held accountable for the false flag attack that we know as the Gulf of Tonkin incident in Vietnam? Why wasn't anyone held accountable for the false intelligence in Iraq? Why wasn't anyone held accountable for the false intelligence and the false premise for war in Afghanistan? And he says that that politicians and military commanders have conspired to deceive the public and their own troops. America is involved in wars that we no longer understand. And I'm quoting Jack right now. Quote, too many politicians are blinded by the dazzling array of administrative awards, not awards for valor, but administrative military awards that adorn the left chest of clean and pressed dress uniforms, worn by generals and admirals with impressive resumes and taxpayer-funded postgraduate degrees, who have largely succeeded in organizations where advancement is predicated on checking boxes and impressing the officer a rung above in the chain of command. Period.
Stuart Schaefer talked about
War is a business and business is good. Take it away, my friend. Close our show for us.
Unfortunately, war is the business of America now. We don't produce things anymore. They offshored all the jobs and our industrial capacity. And the only thing we produce is foreign wars, unfortunately, because it benefits the military contractors. It's a huge business.
How can, is there a particular location where folks can find your articles, find more about you, and find out what these efforts are going to produce?
Well, they can read them at the UNZ Review, unz.com. Ron Unz runs the site. He's a Jewish intellectual, by the way, and has no problem, holding Israel to account. So that he's a kind of a rare individual. And he posted my article, even though he didn't like it. He didn't agree with it, but he posted it. He was willing to post it, so I give him credit for that. But I think we've won the debate now. So we'll see.
Well, Mark, we look forward to meeting you. Either we'll come up to Oregon and meet you someday, or you can come down to Northern California here and stay with us, or stay in maybe the Vichy Springs Resort, which is where we live, right next door to. We would love to meet you in person. I think I speak for Mary. I think you have one of the most dangerous minds in America, and
that's a compliment. Thank you very much.
I urge you to keep writing, to keep researching, to keep basing everything on fact and not on opinion. And I'll leave you with a quote that Michael C. Rupert left me. Do you know who Mike Rupert was?
Yes, certainly.
Yeah. So he was my mentor in getting into public radio. And once he just railed against the term conspiracy theorist. He says, do not be afraid of being labeled a conspiracy theorist. And I said, why, Mike? And he says, well, for obvious reasons. He says, just look at the term conspiracy theorist. He says, almost every argument starts out with a theory.
Mm-hmm.
If you go to court, the prosecutor has a theory that they lay out in the opening arguments, and the defense counsel starts out with a theory that they lay out in their opening arguments. Everything starts with the theory and then moves to a hypothesis and goes from there. So don't be afraid of being labeled a theorist. As far as conspiracy is concerned, again, don't shy away from that term either, because almost everything is a conspiracy. What is a conspiracy? Two or more people. Almost everything in life is accomplished by two or more people, right? So do not shy away from the term conspiracy theorist. Wear it proudly. And Mike preferred using the term conspiracy realist. So I'll leave you with that thought. Mike C. Rupert, American hero.
Mark Gaffney has been our guest for the last hour. Mark, we are so delighted that you were with us, and we do hope that you'll come back. We do hope that fruits of this labor come forth and the truth is put out there.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, John. It's been great.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, Mark.
Very wonderful host.